Welcome to The Real with Ross. Today we are sitting down with Reverend Janiece Williams. She is the homiletician, scholar. She is definitely one in the field that is trailblazing and working her way around the country, training and teaching preachers how to preach. She is the founder of Deep Launch Solutions. She has the Sermon Development Workbook. And today we get a chance to sit down and talk with Reverend Janiece about preaching. So we're so glad to have her with us today. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. And Janiece preached for us yesterday and totally demolished. When I say demolished, I mean demolished in every sense of the word. So I begged her to come and talk to us today about sermon development. So that's kind of what we're going to do. Let's just start talking about your journey. So how did you get started in ministry?
Great journey. So I always like to tell this story by starting with the elephant in the room, which for me is I wasn't raised in the church.
Okay.
In the traditional way that we understand that. So typically when we talk about, being raised in the church, we mean, you was in church Sunday and every day during the week and all that kind of stuff. That's not my story. We would go to church when, either I would spend a night over one of my aunt's house or my aunts who were here yesterday.
Okay.
So we would, either when we would go over there or Easter. And so I'm not really sure how the Lord worked it out. But growing up, although I wasn't raised in the church in that traditional sense, my mom would tell you that when I was 3 years old, when all the other kids were outside playing, I'd be sitting on the couch trying to read the Bible.
Oh,
so it was in me from a child, although I don't know where, I don't recall any kind of like images in my head for where I got that from. To the extent that, growing up as a kid, I would play church with my siblings. So I'm the fifth of six kids. Okay. And so I would make them sit there and listen to me preach and all that kind of stuff, which is so crazy to me because I'm like, we weren't going to church like that. So I don't know where I got that image from, but it was always in me from a child. And so by the time I became a teenager, it really started with me going to church, starting that journey of going to church, which really began one day. It was a Sunday, and this is back when BET would play sermons on TV. So everybody else is at church, me, we at the house chilling. And so I'm watching BET, and there was a sermon that played, and I couldn't tell you what the sermon was about, but I do remember it had touched me so much that I was like, I want to go to church. So I called my auntie Lorraine, who was with us yesterday, and I told her I wanted to go to church. And so she called to have the church van start to come pick us up. Okay. And by us, I mean, I dragged my little sister with me everywhere. Okay. So we started going to church. And as we were going to church, I would get involved in like as much stuff as I can get involved in. So I joined the choir, I joined the prayer ministry, and the more I began to serve, the more I began to really kind of come alive. And so I've been an introvert and been shy my whole life. And so starting to serve in the church and be welcomed in that space really was the time when I really found my place. It was the first time I really kind of felt like this is where I belong. And so I just kind of, ran into it. And so, I became really disciplined in my spiritual life. I was reading my Bible every day. I would ditch my family to go upstairs. Now you're talking about a house with at minimum 8 people in it at any given moment. I would ditch my family at, let's say 9:00. And I would go upstairs so I could spend that last hour with the Lord. Like I was serious. I was a teenager, okay? Yeah. I was so serious about this thing. And so I go upstairs and spend time with the Lord, reading and praying and all that stuff. And then one day there was a revival happening in the city at my aunt's church, the Pentecostal Church of Christ. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. And so Bishop Ellis's church. And this is where on my mom's side of the family is where my aunts and my cousins went. And so there was a preacher in town and they were having revival. That week I had been fasting. And so that fast, I was no social media, none of that kind of stuff. And so whenever I would want to get on social media, I'll go read and pray instead. So this particular day is the end of my fast and the Lord had been speaking to me all week. And this particular time I wanted to get on Facebook. So instead I went and opened up my Bible and I said, Lord, speak to me. And me and my theological trainer now would be skeptical of this kind of experience.
Looking back, you're like, okay, I don't know.
Yeah, but the Lord used it, right? Nonetheless. And so it was one of those like, Lord speak, and wherever I open up this Bible, that's what we're going to read. Mm-hmm. So I opened it up and it landed on Isaiah 61:1. Spirit of the Lord God is upon me because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the meek. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and the opening of the prison to them that are bound. And I was like,
and you closed the book.
I did. I was
like Jesus.
Literally, it's like, are you trying to tell me I'm called to preach? So I opened it back up and like kept on reading and was like, Lord, if you calling me to preach, please confirm it in revival tonight. So I go to church that night and we sitting, incognito in the back, and the preacher goes, and again, me and my theological education now would be skeptical of it, but then the preacher goes, I don't know who this is for, but the Lord said the answer to your question is yes.
Wow.
And it was like a sense of affirmation on the inside of me. My body got hot. Like I just knew that the Lord was talking to me in this moment. And I was like, my God, today, I couldn't even tell you what happened the rest of that service, but I just remember that I felt this sense of confirmation. And so the interesting thing is that, the only church I've ever known is a Baptist church, Temple Baptist Church in Cleveland, Ohio. And Pastor Cedric Ville is the only pastor I ever knew growing up in Cleveland. And so we had never had women preachers.
Okay.
So I didn't even know if my pastor believed in women preachers. So now I got this sense of call from God. But I'm like, I don't even know if my pastor believes in women preachers. Now, I had never seen women be outright told you couldn't preach. I just had never really seen them in my church context. I knew one, in the Baptist world, I knew one preacher, but I had never seen her preach. I just knew that she was an evangelist, a minister. And so I texted my pastor, who's also my godfather. I texted him and I said, do you believe in women preachers? And immediately he was like, yeah. I believe they can bring forth the word, and so I was like, okay, bet. Like, I never expounded. I probably planted the seed at that moment, but I never expounded on what was going on.
And how old were you at this point?
Ooh, probably 17 years old. Yeah, probably 17. Yeah, I was 17. So then I probably planted the seed at that moment because he and I didn't talk anymore about it, didn't elaborate. But I had told my little sister and my little cousin, because we were running thick as thieves, at that point. And so both of them, knew that I was getting ready to go tell him like, hey, I think the Lord might be calling me to preach. And so we go up one Sunday as we normally do. We went up to his office every Sunday to say hey to our Godfather. And so we went up there one Sunday and I said, God, Daddy, I need to talk to you. I probably scared the mess out of him. I said, I need to talk to you. And so he cleared the room. And it's just he and I go, I think God is calling me to preach. And he was like, all right, let's talk about it. Like it was like immediately like this acceptance and this affirmation. And I started my ministers in training journey. I mean, I had been serving faithfully at my church every week. Like once I started going to church, I was there. Them doors was open. Janiece Williams was there. Okay, I was there. So like I'm sure in a way I had demonstrated evidence, right? But now it was the time to profess the calling, and my pastor was immediately embracing of it and affirming of it, and that's really, really how it got started.
Okay, and so from there you went to do undergrad work.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna take a sharp turn. Where did your love for the development of sermons and preaching start?
Okay, great question. I would say that my love for preaching started really around the same time. So when I started going to church, I just would go on YouTube and just listen to a bunch of preaching. Now, mind you, my pastor was giving it to us every week, right? Like Cedric Ville, right? Like he was giving it to us every week, right? And so I learned to love preaching, listening to him preach. I learned to love preaching, going on YouTube and looking up different preachers. I would listen to, Pastor E. Dewey Smith. I would listen to Juanita Bynum. I was listening to Marissa Farrow, and I mean, just so many just different voices. Reggie Sharp, like anybody that I could find on YouTube, I was listening to them, and at the time, I wasn't looking at it for, you know, the mechanics of preaching. I just was enjoying receiving a word, and I just knew that there was something in this thing called preaching that was enlivening me. There was something in it that would change me, and I mean, I'm listening and I'm taking notes every time around. So that's really where the love of preaching started. Where the love of sermon development started, you know, it's interesting because first I think, you know, that, you know, starts again with being trained by Pastor Ville, because when we started our ministers in training, our preaching classes, he would meet with us for an hour on Sundays before worship. And so he would meet with all the ministers, and, you know, we would talk, and he would teach us what, you know, our very first lesson was the difference between exegesis and eisegesis. So, like, you know, and I remember him telling us, you know, you'll never preach an eisegesis sermon at Temple Baptist Church. Oh, wow, okay. He said like in the back of my head, like from the very beginning. So it was like, bet, say no more, do your due diligence, like immediately. And then also getting his feedback on sermons, like, you know, we would have to submit our sermons, and he would, that red ink, you know. So, you know, I remember recently I did some work with some ministers in training, and they were, you know, frustrated about the red ink that their pastor, and I was like, man, like that's normal. Like the red ink is what makes you better. It's what makes you better. That is red for the blood, doc. So, I mean, I think that was really the beginning, but when my love for sermon development probably really started to crystallize for real when I got to seminary, because in undergrad, I didn't know that you could pursue preaching the way that I'm doing it now. So I was, you know, I knew that I was going to get, at that point, I knew I was going to go pursue doctoral work. And I thought I was either going to be a theologian or I was going to be a Bible scholar. And because I had never taken a ministry class before. So my undergrad degree is in biblical and theological studies. And at my school, Nyack College, there were two sides of our ministry department. So there was the ministry majors, and that was your pastoral men, youth ministry, those kinds of degrees. And then on my side of it was the biblical and theological studies majors. And on this side, they were training scholars. They were training folks who they believe one day would go into the academy. And so we didn't take any, unless we took an elective of our own volition, we weren't taking any practical ministry classes. So I had never taken a preaching class in undergrad. Wow. It was when I got to seminary that I took my first preaching class and was like, you can get a PhD in preaching? Like what? Like what? It was then that I really started to learn the mechanics of preaching in terms of exegesis and hermeneutics, and, you know, just really kind of being exposed to, you know, even congregational exegesis and things that, like, you know, I don't know that I had the language for, or even a curiosity about early on. And so I think the more that I learned about preaching as time went on, the more that, you know, I became interested in how do we actually get there? And that just kept on building and building and building. And when I started my doctoral program is really when things amped up, when I could actually put language to which part of the process it gives me the most energy. And all of it gives me energy, but the part of the process that leads up to the sermon, that for me just, like it just, because it is the creative part. It is the process of invention. And I've always been a creative. I've always been an artist growing up. And so I think, you know, just as I continue to develop my knowledge of preaching and the mechanics of preaching, I think that's where it really kind of, you know, everything kind of came together in terms of which part of the process for me became, you know, the most energizing. Okay. So I'm going to ask you from the other side of the space, the other side of the room, of the seat, about preaching, and I want you to share your wealth of knowledge and information. For some people who have trouble developing sermons, where the process of putting a sermon together is difficult,
how do you instruct them to begin in the process?
I think the most important part that I think we all know, but just always should be said, is with prayer. Like, you know, the endeavor to develop a sermon is first and foremost a spiritual endeavor. And I think that needs to be first and foremost above anything else. After that, I think, you know, spending time reading the Bible, just like that's not going to fail you. And I think really why a part of the reason why people struggle is because, well, first of all, the endeavor to develop a sermon is going to be a struggle. If you're not struggling with it, you ain't doing it right? You should be wrestling, you know, with it. But I think a part of the reason why people struggle to that extent is because they start the process attempting to write a sermon. Instead of starting the process attempting to get to know this text, right? Like we skip the exegetical process and go straight to what does it mean for me, or what does it mean for my listeners, as opposed to getting to know the text at hand. Additionally, I think that the piece that really gets people is coming to the text with our foreknowledge of the text. And with our foreknowledge of our Christian traditions, and with the foreknowledge of, you know, all the things that we've been taught as believers in our formation, all that kind of stuff. And I think that is a gift, but I also think that it can be a hindrance in terms of the sermon development process, because when we come to the text believing that we already know the background of the text, it gets in the way of our ability to discern something new, to explore something new. You know, when I teach about this, I usually tell folks, you know, I've never been married before, but I'm told that you got to keep dating your partner, you know, even as y'all are married, right? Because as life happens, people change, right? And so there's this constant need to continue to get to know the other. Well, I think the same is true of the way that we engage the biblical text, is that, you know, as you continue to change and as the world continues to change, you know, you become different. And so you need to continue to get to know this text from a different lens, because life experience will help you to see things that you wouldn't have seen before, you know, in times past. And so I think suspending your foreknowledge, which is really hard to do. It's difficult to divorce yourself from who you are and what you know. Right? But you really have to force yourself to, I mean, even if that means you got sticky notes on the side and just write down whatever intrusive thought it is that's coming to mind and put it to the side, so that you really can get to know that text at hand. And to spend a lot of time doing it. Like, I mean, spend some time just writing down the obvious things in the text. You know, Jesus walked. Yes, like it feels so, well, duh, but like you never know what kind of revelations might come out of just stating the obvious in the text. And suspending the need to interpret immediately, right? Good revelation only comes from good investigation. And so, you know, we really have to spend time investigating that text before we ever try to turn it into a sermon. And it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of hard work. And I think that as we, you know, develop the discipline of getting to know the text, I think we'll realize how many sermons actually might be present in that one passage of scripture. But it really starts with, I think, just read the Bible. Just get to know the text on its terms, and not yours, and not your incessant need to interpret and your incessant need to apply it to your life or the life of whoever may or may not be listening to you.
What do you think are the most common mistakes of preachers in the sermon development process?
That what I was just talking about in terms of not suspending our foreknowledge of a text. I think that is a common mistake, because it feels like a shortcut when you just, you know, you come to the text knowing a thing about it. But what it really is a hindrance to your ability to see something new. That for sure for me is a common mistake. I think also, I really don't think people read the Bible. Like I've been thinking about that a lot recently.
They don't read the Bible.
Because people not reading the Bible, you know, and And I don't even mean devotionally. We do it devotionally, right?
Yeah. Most.
You know, in theory, we do it devotionally, right? Down to, you know, you're getting, you know, your verse of the day from the Bible app on your phone. So, you know, to a certain extent, we do it devotionally. But man, just really kind of sitting there, just reading. I am astounded at our unwillingness to read the Bible. Pastor Ville would say, don't be a casual Bible reader, you know, and I just think that we've gotten casual, you know, and too many preachers are casual in their engagement with the Bible. So I think that's one thing. I think another thing is jumping immediately to the sermon before figuring out where your destination is. I am so big on figure out what your thesis is. Like to the point where like my friends, like when they'll call me and their work, you know, they want to bounce some ideas off of me. They already know the first question I'm going to ask, to the point where if they don't already have it, they're going to tell me up front, I don't have a thesis yet. Okay. Right? Because I'm going to ask, like, what's your thesis? I can't help you process without knowing where you're trying to go. Right? Which isn't, you know, altogether true, because I can help you figure out what it is you're trying to say. But like that thesis really becomes the thing that filters the rest of the content in the sermon, if you let it, right? And then we're also, you know, we also have to learn how to craft a strong thesis statement, because a paragraph isn't a thesis statement, right? It's helping you get there, right? So don't throw the paragraph away, but the paragraph itself isn't the thesis. And I think we have to figure out and really kind of workshop and spend more time figuring out what that final destination is. Because that's how we end up preaching multiple sermons, right? We don't have a strong thesis. And then when you don't have a strong thesis, you can't figure out in your movements how those movements are connected to that thesis, because you don't have one. But usually what I'll tell my students is, you know, once you develop that thesis statement and you start thinking through whatever your movements are, your question to yourself should be, what is the thesis of this movement and how is it connected to that ultimate claim of the sermon, right? And I think once you begin to do that, that kind of forces you into one idea for the sermon. Without it, this is how we get into, I got 3 different sermons in this one, you know, proclamation, because you haven't sat down to figure out, you know, what are these movements attempting to argue, and then how are they connected to this main argument that I'm trying to make in the sermon.
So somebody's going to say, who may be listening, okay, so Janiece, how long should my thesis be?
Ooh, honey. What I'll say is, it's not necessarily about length. Now, if you have to explain it, it's too long. So a thesis should be specific, it should be direct, and it should be clear. So by specific means that it shouldn't be so, you know, long that it requires further explanation. It should be direct in the sense that, like, say what you're trying to say. Like, don't go around the corner and, I got another thing I'm gonna say about that, the mistakes that we make. Don't have to jump through hoops. You know, just say what it is you try. I said what I said. Say what you're trying to say, and be clear. Don't be so fanciful in your language that like people can't understand you. At the end of the day, like, you want people to be able to understand what it is you're trying to say. So I would say those would be the 3 things that you need to be thinking about in terms of writing a thesis statement. And there are people who do it really, really well. And if you listen to some of your favorite preachers, like there are folks who are going to give you their thesis statement in their sermon, and they vary in length. But as long as they are those 3 things, specific, direct, and clear, you cooking with grease, right? The other thing I was gonna say in terms of the other mistake is this, I don't know what it is, this is particular to Black preaching. This need to be so artful in our language that we miss the mark of clarity. Like I never sacrifice clarity on the altar of artful language.
That's good.
Because I think that, you know, in our tradition of African American preaching, you know, we have historically, our forerunners have historically used artful language to paint the picture for their listeners. And now when we attempt to do it, you know, it's almost forced in a way, right? And it's almost done in a way, and this isn't true for everybody, but for some folks, you know, it's almost done in a way that it clouds what it is the preacher's actually trying to say. Like, how do you say this in plain language? Like, how is somebody who is uneducated going to understand what you're trying to say? Somebody who's dropped out of school, hasn't picked up a book in years, or maybe they have picked up a book, but like this language is above them. Like, how are they going to understand it? Because at the end of the day, it's cute that you sound good, but you miss the mark if people can't understand what you're trying to say. And this is important because, like, when we think about the way that we use language, our forerunners had to use artful language historically because the way that we processed information was different, right? So we're talking about social media, like when people actually read books, they're before TV even, right? Like, they had to use artful language because there was no one-to-one correlation to an image for people in their minds. Now our attention spans are a lot shorter than that because TV and social media has shortened our ability or limited our ability to process information or to have our attentions held for a longer period of time. So we don't have the amount of time, we don't have the attention span that our elders and ancestors had. And we don't have the need to be as creative in the way that we use language. Now, does that mean throw it out the window? Absolutely not. Be poetic, be artful, like continue to carry forth those traditions of our heritage, but also understand the why behind why our ancestors and elders had to use that kind of language and figure out what it means to do that in today's world, in today's culture, because it's not the same thing. And you'll end up, in an attempt to pretend to be something that you're not, or to pretend to do something that's not true for who you are or true for who your community of listeners are, you'll end up missing the opportunity to bless somebody because you're trying to prove a point about your ability to, be artful in your language. Never sacrifice clarity on the altar of artful language.
That's good. Sometimes in this world of streaming, as I'm preaching and even trying to develop my preaching more, I have to remind myself, Drew, don't preach to the preachers you may think are going to tune in at some point during the week. That you miss your assignment to preach to your congregation who gathers every week. Because if they don't get it, then it means more that they didn't get it than the reality that somebody may or may not watch me this week that's shopping around to see how Drew's preaching now. And sometimes we're pushing for that audience, and sometimes none of those people are tuning in, right? They ain't even watching us as much as we might think that they are. Now, certain people are being watched on a weekly basis, right? But they're naturally just doing what they've been doing forever. But I think that you're right. The challenge of trying to be something that the person is not for the sake of trying to build something. So in the sermon development process, how do you move through the different stages of development?
So I describe it as 3 eyes of exegesis. So you've got investigation, inspiration, and information. The investigative phase is when you are investigating the biblical text, your preaching context, and the wider social world. In this particular phase, it's not the time to find the deeper meaning of the text. It's just an opportunity for you to get it in view and to figure out what's here. It's just looking at the text. It's just getting familiar with the text. It's just writing down, or how I usually describe it as noting what you notice in the text. What's there before you, and just writing all those things down: the who, what, when, where, why's, how's. Doing a sensory exploration of the text. I wonder what it smelled like. I wonder what it felt like. I wonder what it sounded like. Just doing those basic things, noting repetitions in the text, and things of that nature. So that's really the, in terms of the biblical investigative phase. And then you got your congregational investigation, in which for those who are pastoring is a lot easier to do because you spend more time with your congregation. And so you get to figure out who's in the room, right? What are the age demographics? What are the industries that most of my members are, a part of? What are the education levels? Those kind of things. What are the stories that are present here? For those of us who are primarily itinerant preaching, and for pastors who also itinerate, that also includes then going to the church website that you're going to preach at and learning a little bit about the church's history, learning about, what kinds of, programming is important to them. Is this a church that prioritizes worship over service, or is it a church that is really involved in the community? Because it gives you a sense of who that community is. Doing the work of going and listening to a worship service, listening to, altar call prayer. What are the needs that are being expressed in this prayer? Because that kind of gives you some information about what's needed in the congregation. Listening to how the pastor there preaches, because it gives you a sense of what their listening diet is. And just things of that nature. Even, man, if the gift of social media is that as you're watching the service, you can see how people are engaging in the comments, because what might emerge from even the comments are, rhetorical culture, right? So what are some things that are typical for them to say? So for example, my home church now in Nashville, I go to Watson Grove Baptist Church, and so we use the language of partners as opposed to members. It means the same thing, but we use the language of partners. Well, if you're not from our community, you may not know that. Partners, we're in the comments talking about partner. You don't know what that means, but that gives you an opportunity to kind of discern, okay, they use the language of partnership here. What does that say about who they are, and how might I engage that in the sermon? So that's investigation. And then in terms of the congregational, when you get to the social, you need to be watching the news. You need to be, and I know it's depressing. And at this juncture, I would say news, what I'll say about watching the news, be aware of what's going on in the world, be aware of what's going on in the community, because we know that, censorship and, those things are absolutely happening right now. And so finding other news outlets that actually are reporting the truth about what's going on, and going to look at, that local community's happenings. Go and look at the local newspapers, wherever it is you're preaching. Go and datausa.io will give you some data about the city that you're going to preach in. So those are just all of that's investigation. So before we even started trying to figure out, what the word is, word of God for the people of God, thanks be to God is, you're literally just gathering information about the text, about the community, and about, the social conditions, right? And you're just writing all of that down. And then after that, you are going to then reflect on all of that stuff. You're going to meditate on all that stuff. You're going to try to start praying and say, Lord, what are you trying to say? What's coming up for me here? This is the inspiration phase. This is where, you are discerning the word of God for this particular moment of proclamation. And that really is all it is just writing down what's coming up for you. And then you move on to the information phase, which is putting all of this stuff, all of these phases require in between them this moment of reflection on the previous phase as you're engaging the current one. So once you get done with investigation, as you're doing inspiration, you're going back to read those investigative notes. As you're doing information, you're going back to read the previous investigative and inspiration, so that you could put that stuff in conversation with the scholars that you're reading. What commentaries are you in conversation with? There are some online websites, Working Preacher, where there are scholars who are providing free resources. They're writing blogs and stuff about the Bible and about faith and stuff, and so that's good resource. Reading multiple scholars from multiple ethnic backgrounds, not just reading, white scholars, and and then not just reading Matthew Henry. I'm sorry, but and it's not to say, I have always say this, it's not to say don't read Matthew Henry. I'm saying don't just read Matthew Henry, right? There are scholars who spend their entire lives dedicated to one book of the Bible. There's no way Matthew Henry, a book that covers all 66, is going to be able to scratch the surface of, biblical commentary. So my invitation for those who read Matthew Henry is, don't just read Matthew Henry. Go find some multi-volume books.
My invitation is, don't read Matthew Henry.
Listen, I can't tell the saints that, because I get why, right?
Yeah.
Accessibility, right?
Yeah.
Commentaries are expensive, right?
Yeah.
So like, if that's all you got, that's all you got. If that's all you got, some of our Christmas wish lists need to start expanding to include resources that we want to help us become better preachers. Right. You need to ask for a commentary set.
Yeah.
And if it ain't the whole set, just give me Genesis, and I'll build from Genesis to Exodus. Okay, just build up. And there are online resources, right? You can go to the public library, or if you live in a city that has a seminary nearby, see if a lot of their seminaries offer resources to local clergy. Yeah. So just go find out, you know.
But they need to have time to be there, because those commentaries, they don't let you check those things out.
That's right. Those are reference resources, okay?
They are not taking that up out of here.
You are not, But there are just so many different ways to access resources and stuff. And so, I mean, that's the information phase, where you're putting all that stuff in conversation with scholars. All of that is just, before you get to where the sermon at. All of that is the pre-work to where the sermon at, right? Because the sermon is somewhere in all of that. It's somewhere, germinating within all of that work that you just did. Something's coming up for you, some idea, some concept. Dr. William Curtis would say, at this point, you would go and then brood over the text. What's coming up for you? Like, what is that one thing? Like, just spending some time hovering over it and just kind of discerning what's coming up for you there. And after that, like, those are just the exegetical, hermeneutical process. Yeah.
So somebody's going to ask, some working preacher, right, is going to say, how long does all of that take?
As long as it takes is what it takes as long as it takes.
But if you were to give a particular amount of hours, right, for a person that's not doing it week to week or consistently, how long do you think they should block out during the course of, it's going to take a couple of weeks or so for somebody who's probably not preaching every week. How long do you think that they should say, I need to spend a minimum of this amount of hours?
So that's hard for me to answer, because some of us are latent processors. So for some of us, and I'm a latent processor, it takes me time to figure out what it is I'm trying to say. It takes me a longer time to figure out than other folks. And so I want to be like, don't spend any less than 10 hours, right, a week. And if you just need a number, don't spend any less than 10 hours. But that's just scratching the surface, right? And if we're talking about folks who don't do this week to week, you got time then. Like, you just really got time. Now, there are occasions when, we get the last minute call, but you should be ready. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, you should, if you're not doing this every week, you got time to be coming up and practicing how to develop a sermon, right? You should be writing sermons whether you have an assignment or not, right? Like, that you only learn how to preach by preaching. Right. You only learn how to write a sermon by writing sermons. You have to exercise that muscle. And so I want to be able to say this amount of hours. I mean, if I have to put a number on it, don't spend any less than 10 hours. But for real, it takes time. It takes a lot of time to do that kind of work. You're doing research, and not just any kind of research. You're doing holy research. You're doing spiritual research. You're not just researching with books. You're researching with the Holy Spirit. And so there are some things that just gonna take some time. You know what takes me the longest? What? Developing my thesis statement. Okay. After I've done all of that, like them 3 phases, when I get to start trying to figure out what my thesis statement is, that takes me the longest amount of time, because now I'm trying to figure out, how do I encapsulate this idea that's coming up for me in a sentence? That takes me the longest amount of time. So if that's taking, I remember one time, I just couldn't nail it down. I just could not nail it down. I'm texting friends like, man, this is what I'm trying to say. And it ain't making sense to me as I'm explaining it, but like I know it like in the back of my like head or maybe in my heart, like I know what it is I'm trying to get at, but I just can't nail it down. And I spent all day. I'm at my computer all day. I'm walking around my office all day. I'm walking around my house, taking a walk around the complex, like, and just could not nail it down till my friend was like, maybe you should just sleep on it. So I went to sleep and I woke up the next morning and I sat down and then it came to me. But this is after I spent 12 hours the day before. And I'm not even exaggerating. I literally couldn't figure it out because for me, I can't write the rest of the sermon until I know where I'm going.
Right.
So I just can't. Like I cannot get past what my thesis statement is. And so if that took me 12 hours, that's what we done already got past the, you know, the 10 hour
already exceeded the 10, right.
You know?
And you haven't even started putting anything down on paper yet.
No. So that's hard to say. I would say it might take you 10 to get through the 3 I's of exegesis. But once you start trying to get to thesis, objectives, so what, like all the things that, you know, give you the structure of your sermon, that could easily add another 10. I mean, minimum. So it's particular to the person, but if you, oh man, I don't even want to say 10. I want to say like 20. But if you're not pastoring every week, 20, because you know, you got more than just that week to prepare. So I don't know if I answered that well. But
No, I think that's good. All right, so let's talk about crafting. Now, I don't want to say how should a preacher craft. I'm going to say how do you? How do you take the substance content of your 3 I's and build it into the finished work and product of what someone would see if they heard you preach?
So you mentioned earlier about my workbook. I use my workbook to write every sermon that I'm writing. And so in it, once I've gotten past the 3 phases of exegesis, then it's asking me to write, you know, my thesis, my objective, my so what statement. Once I've written those, it's asking me, now what are your movements? And so I'm figuring out, this is what, you know, movement 1 is. The next part it's asking me is, how is this connected to your thesis statement? Because right now, even in the planning process, I'm chasing after clarity. And so for me, and clarity is of utmost importance for me. Like I want to be clear. I want to, words matter to me. So in the entire process, the workbook is actually designed to force you into clarity, to force you into making a decision. But if you do it right, if you follow all the steps that it's asking you to follow, then you're entering into a space of clarity, hopefully. And so I'm writing down what my movement is. I'm figuring out how is this connected to my thesis statement. So I've done that for all the movements that I'm going to do. Then the next part of it is, okay, what illustrations or stories are you going to use? And so I'm actually in the planning process figuring out, all right, what stories and stuff am I going to use? What's the main claim of these stories that I'm trying to draw out? And it's also asking, how is this connected to your thesis, right? Because, you know, nothing's worse than an irrelevant story.
Right.
So all of these things are pre-planned before I ever get to my manuscript. And so, but once I have all of that figured out, you know, I literally have everything that I need to write my manuscript. And then, you know, I am a traditional 3-point, you know, preacher. Like that for me is what's comfortable. And so I really just, I have all the things that I need. So I know what my introductory story is. I have a pretty standard format in terms of how I'm gonna work out the organization of my sermon. So I'm likely most times going to give you some kind of story or illustration at the very beginning. Then I'm going to, you know, use that to introduce us to our text, because there's some idea or in some kind of concept that in this story that is illuminated in this text, or that this text illuminates for us. And so I use that to enter into the text. Once I'm entering into the text, now I'm starting to help us to arrive at whatever that claim is that I'm trying to make. I'm gonna make my claim. I'm gonna give you some, so in other words, this is what this means. Then I'm gonna give you, a, so how do we do this? Like, how do we get at whatever this thesis statement is? That how question is really kind of getting at my objectives, like, or my so what statement. How is it that we get at this thesis statement? And then we enter into my 3 movements. Last year I did a lot of work on storytelling. I was trying to become a better storyteller. And so all of my movements would have stories in them or some kind of, most of them actually, now I think, stories. I was gonna say some of them were just like examples. I use examples, I use stories to illuminate whatever the idea is, but I'm gonna give you the thesis of the movement. And then and all my movements have theses. Like, I think people should do that. You don't have to actually say the thesis in your sermons. I do, but I'm gonna give you my theses in my sermon, and then I'm gonna argue it in the text, give you a story, and ride to the next one. So, and that's pretty standard. My conclusion, which is for me the hardest part, in the introduction. So my intro and my conclusion are the hardest parts for me. Like, that's the parts I struggle with the most. But again, I maybe about 2 years ago is where I really kind of found what my closing rhythm is. And so I will tell a story to help me close, but also that's really a strategy to keep me at a good pace, because I have a tendency to talk fast. And so, especially in my preaching. So the story is intended to slow me down, but also to help me not, because when I'm so excited, like I will close up here and then I'll have no voice. And especially if I got to do it multiple times, and I got to preserve my voice too. So it's actually better for me so that I can control my pace and my where I'm landing, vocally, to tell a story, to force me into being able to control it more. And then I'm gonna give you a run, because I like a run. I like a run.
Yeah, you're gonna close strong.
Oh, yeah. I hope so.
No, I hope so. Yeah, I heard you twice yesterday. You're gonna close strong.
Okay, praise the Lord.
So in that flow, right? One of the things that I heard of you yesterday that I paid attention to, because one of the things I shared with you yesterday is, I think that one of the challenges of preachers who listen to preaching is that most of the time they just listen to be blessed. They don't listen to see how the person is accomplishing the task of the sermon throughout the sermon. How are they building this house? And I definitely heard the introduction that started with the story and led into the text. I heard yesterday at both services a question raised. So do you develop a relevant question that goes along with your sermon each time, or are there just times where there's something that you believe that the audience is asking in relationship to the text and you want to expose that as you move along?
So I develop what I call a so what question.
Okay.
Why this sermon? Okay. Like, what is happening in the world, or what is happening in the lives of our listeners that this sermon seeks to attend to, and this is for me what I call the rhema of the sermon. Like, what's the rhema for this sermon, right? What makes this sermon a rhema for these people at this time? And so for every sermon, I'm gonna raise a question, and that kind of question. Now I know, for folks who are Proctor, fans of Dr. Proctor, but I don't know if this would be considered a relevant question or anything like that. But this, for me, helps ground the sermon in everyday life, because I'm attempting to address some kind of a real life, how am I supposed to, or how can I, kind of a question to help enflesh the sermon.
Yeah. So then also, as a part of what I witnessed yesterday, the way that you unearth things in the text that I would say are the dangers of what you talked about in the beginning. You do a great job of saying, this is how the text would normally be seen or presented. However, when you look at it in its original language and its original intent, it really doesn't mean that. It means this. So like yesterday, you talked about this whole piece of Mrs. Job and how when Job says to her, you foolish woman, and it's really more like your words don't match your character. Yeah. Not that you're a fool, but it's what you're saying is not who I know you to be, right? How do you suggest to a preacher to have the confidence to push against the normative ways of preaching a text and not be fearful that the text may be written off to people because it's not presenting the normative ways?
So I think, number one, you actually have to do your homework, right? And so this is where it is important to be in conversation with those scholars and thought leaders on a text, because that kind of a thing came up just reading multiple commentaries. If you happen to have access to, Hebrew scholars, Greek scholars and stuff like that, call them and ask them a question, right? But most of us don't have access to that, right? So like you really just have to let those commentaries be your friend and read multiples, especially when we're reading those texts that can be harmful, right? Like this passage has been used to denigrate women, right? Like Job's wife has always been demonized across the history of Christianity, right? When, a lot of us wrestle with those kinds of questions. How in the world are you holding on to your integrity with everything that we got going on? Like, what is this? Like, you would be mad too. Like, and we have those moments too, right? And so I think it's a matter of, one, doing your homework, but then two, finding parallel situations in real life where people are actually wrestling with that. So this is the, before you get mad at Miss Job, remember that, when you lost 3 loved ones in a few months time span, you were mad at God too, right? When and finding those real life examples really kind of help people see themselves in the text, and it gives them a different posture towards whoever that person is that you're seeking to illuminate, or make the center of conversation. Also, you just got to say the thing, right? You got to say the thing when it comes to the actual moment of proclamation. There may be people who are going to push against what you said, and that's fair. That invites conversation. We only get better when we are in conversation with people who are willing to say, hey, I don't know about that, right? Now, have those conversations before too, right? Like you should be in conversation with friends and colleagues. You should have a preaching partner, right? I have a friend who's also seminary grad, brilliant person. And he actually is the person I workshop this sermon with. Like I'm thinking through, this interpretation that I'm seeing in the text, and just being in conversation with him before it ever made it to the sermon, because I'm like, this could be wrong. And I remember, in writing that sermon, I remember just, not being sure of myself, not being sure of this interpretation, because it was a push against, not intentionally. It wasn't like I was actively like, I'm pushing against that, right. But it was what I was seeing in the text, right? But I knew that it was a push against common, ways of interpreting the text. And so being in conversation with people to help you think through in the process, identifying parallel experiences in real life, and having done your homework, and then just go say the thing. Yeah.
So illustrations can be hard for people. Yeah. Again, I go back to, I listened to you yesterday twice, and I heard 6 different illustrations that, in addition to the start and the finish, but every point had a way of illustrating the point. And I was just sitting there like, this is masterful. In a very strong way, you pulled from so many different places. I think by the time the sermon was over yesterday, I said, that daggone Janiece has taken us from the jellyfish who had this inescapable way of continuing to keep on going. to Finding Nemo, right?
Yeah.
And everything right in between. I mean, the sermon started off talking about somebody in Australia, to the jellyfish, to Finding Nemo, like, and you even brought in Brandy, lyrics from Brandy. I mean, it's a wide range of things that I would say masterfully pull in so many different types of audiences, right? To the brainiac who's a fan of, world events or history, right? You got Australia, right? To the child or person who just loves movies and has always watched certain things, you've got Finding Nemo.
And everybody responded to that Finding Nemo.
What? I was like, Janiece has pulled all of them in with Finding Nemo. But then to hear the oohs and ahs when you quoted Brandy, right? I mean, there's so many different pockets of places. And then, I don't know if you heard this in the preaching yesterday, but when you talked about the fish, somebody on the second row called the fish by the same name you did as you were preaching, because he might have been the only one in the room who knew about it.
I did hear that.
Right, but there's somebody who understands it. And my question really to you for preachers is, how do you create such a balance in finding illustrative material, content for the sermon that is going to speak to all the different pockets that can be within an audience?
So transparently, I don't know that as I'm thinking about stories, that I'm thinking about in those moments, how many people can I reach with the story?
Okay.
Right? I am just thinking about what ways can I enflesh this idea? Well, in what ways can I give a window into this claim that I'm trying to make? I usually do more of the how can I connect with multiple people in my runs. So like throughout the sermon, there's going to be a run in probably every movement. They'll be shorter than like in my conclusion, but like there's going to be a run, because in those places where I'm giving you real life snapshots of this that I'm trying to make a claim about, I'm like able to, you can call on somebody who's experiencing this experience. You can call on somebody who's, this age group. You can call on, when it comes to stories, man, I just be reading and watching. Like I legit will read random books and will watch TikToks and YouTube. I watch a lot of documentaries and when I say that I really love documentaries, I watch documentaries about the solar system. I love astronomy. So I watch all kinds of documentaries about the universe, and just like I've always been a nerd that way. Science, I love it. So I'm watching documentaries about animals and stuff. And then I literally have like a running note in my phone for just like illustrations. And I never know when I'm going to use the illustration. It just, as I see them and as they seem like, oh, this might be useful at some point, I just write it down and just put it in the note and just leave it there until like, oh my goodness, this might fit. And then, and then sometimes I'm in search of a story. So the Cataraqui, which is the ship that was carrying the immigrants to Australia, I found that because when I got the idea for the sermon, which I got this idea like a while ago, it had just been germinating for some time, and I actually bought a couple books because I'm like, I want to learn about shipwrecks. So there's a book called A History of the World in 12 Shipwrecks. So I bought that. Never finished it because it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. But I'll keep it for at some point. It might come in handy. Then I went on YouTube and was looking for stories about shipwrecks. So that's a real story that happened, and I literally was just watching the guy tell stories about different shipwrecks, and I was like, what I was trying to do was paint an image of what the people in the text were likely experiencing. This is what, because we don't have any record of, that particular shipwreck, but there are shipwrecks that happen throughout the world. So how do I help people understand just how catastrophic this event was? Well, I went and found a story of a real life shipwreck, and especially because I was taking a different angle, dealing with the swimmers. So I'm like, how do I help people understand just what these people were experiencing, and how do I prove what I know that I found in my investigation, that, you know, the water was filled with debris, and how difficult is it that you've already, after all this 45 plus days of, you know, trauma on this ship, now you got to swim through the debris. Like, how do I paint that picture for them? Well, I went and found the story, you know, and so sometimes it's the story found me, other times I found the story. And, you know, it's just about, again, when you know what claim it is you're trying to make, it's a lot easier to figure out, you know, okay, how do I illustrate that claim? You can't illustrate a claim you know nothing of, right? So that goes back to the, you know, being intentional about, this is the main claim of the sermon, and then these are the claims that I'm making in every movement. And then once you get clear on those things, it's a lot easier to then pair some kind of story with them.
Now, I guess as we kind of round up, from your teaching side of what you've seen as you've been out working with preachers, helping develop preachers in the craft of preaching, what do you think that preachers need to learn how to do better?
I just feel like this moment of inclusio, right? Returning back to the conversation we had at the beginning. Read and exegete the Bible. Like, we really not doing that enough. Like, I really don't think, two things actually. So I would say reading and exegeting the Bible and really just spending time with it. I remember someone said to me, a couple ministers said to me, I was doing a workshop with associate ministers, which I really love to do because, you know, a lot of folks don't have access to seminary. And so I love to go and work with associate ministers and just partner with pastors in that work.
So invite her.
Right,
so invite her.
But part of the reason why is because it teaches me so much about how to teach and what needs to be taught. Because I literally had several ministers come to me and say, I didn't realize this was so hard. I didn't realize this took so much time. And because I think, you know, people think that we just get sermons by osmosis or something. But they don't realize how much work it is to exegete the text, how much work goes into that final product. We see on Sundays and in revivals, we see this, you know, this big, you know, cataclysmic, grandiose moment of, you know, oratory excellence, right? But there was so much work that went into it, right? And even with, you know, some of the folks that, you know, are you know, Mount Rushmores of preaching, you know, they put a lot of work into it, right? Folks were constantly reading books, right? Constantly reading the Bible, constantly reading books. So that stuff was, and for, you know, some of our favorites today, like there's so many you talk to, you know, of our favorites who will tell you they really be reading the Bible, they really be reading books, and that stuff just never turns off in their minds, right? And so really spending time exegeting the Bible and coming to the Bible and suspending as much as you possibly can that foreknowledge and suspending what it is you want the text to say and just letting the text speak for itself on its own terms. I think that's something, you know, that folks could do better. And then also that really developing and spending time to develop that thesis statement, because that thing will be your saving grace. You know, when people talk about like, they wrote a sermon and the sermon was 45 minutes. First of all, no. Like, if you're the pastor of the church, go and do whatever it is you want to do, right? But if you were getting invited to go preach somewhere, ask them how much time you have. And for the most part, they're not giving you, most places aren't. Some places will. Minutes. But like 45 minutes is a very long time. And if you're a guest preacher, especially if you're an associate minister, you know, honor the time that was given to you, right? And the only way you're going to be able to cut down the sermon that's 45 minutes in its origin down to a 30-minute sermon is your thesis statement. Your thesis statement then becomes your filter. And you can ask yourself using your thesis statement of the rest of the content in the sermon, do I need to say this in order to support this thesis statement? If the answer is no, you can cut it out.
Yeah.
If you don't need to say this thing, or if you don't need to give this particular image or example in order to support that claim, then you don't need that particular piece.
Right.
I think once we figure out how to encapsulate that main claim in a sermon, I think that we will develop stronger sermons. Clarity for me is exceedingly important, and I think you only get at that by developing a clear thesis statement.
Okay. All right, last thing I'm going to ask you, and this is going to jog your brain.
Oh God, I feel like I know where this is going, but go ahead.
Give us some books.
I knew that was what you was getting.
Give us some books
to
read that particularly will help someone in their approach to developing sermons.
Okay. Wow. Ooh, man. God, I want to give you my entire comprehensive exam list. There are so many. So I'm going to start with my advisor, Lisa Thompson's book, Ingenuity. In it, she has so many different exercises en route to developing a sermon for the sake of exegesis and hermeneutics that I think will really benefit preachers in their development process. So Ingenuity by Lisa Thompson. I will say you really cannot go wrong with Thomas Long's Witness of Preaching. Like, I mean, to date, I think it is still an excellent book that walks you through the actual process of exegesis. Like he just gives it all to you there. It's a classic. So Witness of Preaching by Thomas Long. In terms of form, do I get to talk about form?
Sure,
okay.
Go for it.
In terms of form, there's so many. Y'all already know it. I gotta be measured. And okay, let me think. Of course, you know Certain Sound of the Trumpet, Kenyatta Gilbert's Journey and Promise of African American Preaching, Frank Thomas's Celebration. There's just so many. I mean, man. In terms of the exegetical process, like that's the hard one, because you and I have these conversations about how many of them actually do that part of the process. Right. And that's why I'm like, for that process, I will give you Witness of Preaching and Ingenuity, because I think they really do a great job at that. And then I'll give you a bibliography to give to people.
Okay.
And Sermon Development, a workbook for preachers. That's by right.
Sell it. We'll put it on the screen. Awesome. Yeah, put it on the screen. Okay, so if somebody is trying to get to you, they want to be in a coaching session with you, they want to bring you to do something for their ministers, you have a cohort that you developed for women. Talk about your work.
Oh, okay. So
everything you're doing.
I'm gonna start with the Daughters of Elizabeth because it's going amazingly. So in January we launched Daughters of Elizabeth, which is a 12-week group coaching cohort of women, 5 women at a time, where we meet every week and focus on one of the preachers in the group and their actual preaching practice, and we're giving them feedback on their sermons and actually in real time helping them to figure out and to think about their actual preaching practice. And that's going so well. It literally gives me life every time. And so this was our inaugural cohort, and I'm absolutely going to do this again in the fall. And so we have about 5 weeks left in this cohort. And so it is just everything. And I'm just so excited. And a word about Elizabeth in the language of Daughters of Elizabeth. So in the history of Black preaching, Elizabeth is the name of the first Black woman we have on record, the first Black woman preacher we have on record. And she wrote her autobiography in this little pamphlet, and her spiritual autobiography. And she was a preacher. She was an enslaved Black woman. And this is the first name that we have on record, just Elizabeth. And so all of us, from Jarena Leon down, right, are Daughters of Elizabeth. And so I thought to name it, after the first Black woman on record that we have who named herself a preacher. And so there's that. And then I also do, preaching labs with associate ministers and pastors. And so I've gone to churches to do 2-day workshops where I come in and we literally spend hours just working through the sermon development process. And so I'm literally giving them, instruction and then also a lot of workshopping so they can in real time get feedback on the mechanics of developing a sermon. And then of course, the sermon development workbook, which, blew my mind how fast and wide it actually went. When it originally, that was never the intent. I talk about all the time that, when I created the workbook, I actually created the workbook like a year before I ever actually posted it. It was supposed to just be a companion to my coaching practice, because I also work with preachers individually. I do individual coaching as well. And I developed the workbook. So the first couple of people that I coached actually have an earlier iteration of the workbook before it was called sermon development. It was called homiletic coaching with Janiece Williams. So they have that version of it. But now, it later was a thing that I just happened to post the inside of on Instagram story one day. And Dr. Diamond Brooks and Dr. Ricky Harvey Jr. both were like, oh, where can I get that? And they were first people to buy it that like the same day, like within minutes of each other. They were they didn't know it, but they literally like within minutes of each other, it was almost like they were competing to see who could get it first. And then the next day I was like, well, let me see what happens if I post this. And the rest is history.
It went bananas quick.
Quick. And so, I'm grateful for that, because it affirmed this work that my soul must have. And so, the sermon development workbook, I still think, like I said, I use it every time around, like every sermon that I write. I usually bring it with me when I preach, and I didn't bring it. I have a sermon idea that I'm working on, at least in my heart, and I was going to start work. Every time I get done preaching, I'm ready to preach again. So I got a sermon idea, and I just wish I would have brought it with me because I'm itching to, like itching to get ready. But yeah, so sermon development workbook, which, is a great gift for pastors to give to their associate ministers who they're, trying to train in preaching. And those are the primary ways. So individual coaching, sermon development workbook, individual coaching. I do group coaching, preaching labs with associate ministers, and then now the 12-week Daughters of Elizabeth cohort, which will be launching again in the fall. Okay.
Are you still doing the study groups that you were doing?
Yeah, so the preaching lab is actually a small online community where, we talk about preaching. We're always in conversation about preaching. I host weekly co-working groups through it. So you have to actually be a member of the preaching lab to access those group co-working space. And then also we do quarterly webinars where we've had, Pastor John Faison come and teach about preaching. We've had Dr. Danielle Brown come and teach about preaching. And I'll tease it here because I've already got confirmation for it. But our next speaker will be Bishop Rudolph McKissick, and he'll be coming to talk. And so, every quarter we've got somebody new coming to talk about preaching. And that's just accessible to the people in the lab. They also get free resources. So, I've given them a congregational exegesis, template, giving them, a self-exegesis template. And so any new resources that I develop that are going to be like free and stuff, they all get that for free. And so that's the preaching lab. So you can access that on my website as well.
Okay. Janiece has all the resources. Give us your website one more time so that we have it. And I definitely urge every preacher and everyone who knows a preacher to give them the information so that they have it.
Yeah. So my website is, I have two websites, but my personal website, you can access the other one too. But JanieceRenee.com. Now, my name is spelled Janiece. This is important because that Jen is misspelling. It's killing people. It kills people every time around. But JanieceRenee.com, you can access everything that I have.
Okay, all right. And then as we close, I want you to look into your camera and give, from a homiletician standpoint, a final word to preachers about what preaching means, especially Black preaching, in this current climate?
My philosophy of preaching is that good preaching keeps people alive. That at the end of the day, when we do our due diligence on the side of sermon development, when we do our due diligence on the side of exegeting a text and getting to know who our congregation is, at the end of the day, all that boils down to the idea and the reality that good preaching keeps people alive. There are people that come into a preaching space week in and week out, or revival, whatever the context is. There are people that come into those spaces ready to give up on life, trying to figure out if they're gonna go home and end it all, trying to figure out how they're gonna navigate this political climate that's quite literally threatening the livelihood of real life human beings each and every day. And they're listening to figure out, what does God have to say to that? At the end of the day, life is on the line of our preaching. And when we are faithful to do our due diligence in the preparation of a sermon, I believe God will be faithful in making that sermon do a new thing in the lives of our listeners. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Janiece Williams, thank you.
Thank you.
Raw conversation. Navigating the natural and theology, influencing people to find purpose and live with quality. We descended to Christ, just acknowledge me. The sacred scriptures tell us, throw down your nets, come and follow me. A leadership that's anointed and appointed. When leading God's people, sometimes you become disappointed. You do what you can, you do what you know. You give it to God and let it go, go, go.